The queen gave her orders with calm certainty. Every servant must paint their skin gray, darken their eyes, and move like the dead. No laughter was permitted, no voices above a whisper. Every corridor of the palace became a corridor of graves. At night she sat on her throne draped in black. Claiming spirits circled her chamber. She said they spoke to her. She said the living world no longer mattered. The court obeyed, terrified, trembling, yet compelled by her power. Servants shuffled silently in decayed costumes, bowing like corpses risen from soil. Meals were brought on black cloths. Musicians played funeral hymns instead of courtly songs. The palace was not a home. It was a mausoleum still standing. And then one night, a servant disappeared, vanished without sound, without trace. Some swore they saw him dragged by unseen hands. Others claimed the queen herself smiled too long as if she knew. The whispers grew louder. Was this theater, or had death truly joined her court? The queen's command was not a suggestion. It was law, etched into the lives of everyone who stepped inside her palace. By daylight, the kingdom saw her as a grieving widow who had lost too much to death. But within those walls, the truth was grotesque. She demanded that life itself bend to resemble the grave. Each morning, servants lined up in the hall to receive their death instructions. Powder mixed with ash was rubbed onto their faces, their lips painted pale blue, their fingernails stained as if rotting. They shuffled slowly, practicing the broken, dragging steps of a corpse. And if one servant moved too quickly, she would hiss at them. The dead do not hurry. At mealtimes, laughter was outlawed. Every dish arrived covered in black cloth. Plates were lowered gently as though offerings to a tomb. Meat was cut into thin, decayed slivers. Even wine had to be poured without sound, as though silence itself had become holy. The queen's obsession went further. She instructed musicians to unlearn joyful songs and instead play dirges, low and trembling, meant to resemble the chants of funerals. The palace gardens, once filled with birdsong, were stripped of color. White lilies replaced roses, stones replaced fountains. She called it the sanctuary for the departed. At first, courtiers whispered that it was grief. She had lost a husband, perhaps a child. They pitied her. They excused her madness. But pity slowly turned into terror. Because her rules were not grieving rituals, they were performances that never ended. Night after night, she gathered the servants into the main chamber. There, torches flickered against the cold stone. She sat on her throne wrapped in black veils, demanding the dead be honored. And she would ask each servant to kneel, bow their head, and whisper, "We welcome the dead among us." Some claimed she truly heard voices in reply. Others swore they saw her eyes follow invisible shapes across the hall. Her hands would rise as if stroking faces no one else could see. Sometimes she would murmur back, answering questions no living soul had asked. One evening, the queen announced a new command. Every servant was to sleep on the floor in the great hall, bodies stretched out as though laid in coffins. They lay there, eyes closed, whispering chants she had given them. Some nearly fainted from exhaustion, but no one dared resist. To refuse was to risk banishment, or worse. Whispers spread through the kingdom beyond the palace walls. Merchants spoke of seeing carts leaving the castle at night, carrying objects shaped like bodies wrapped in cloth. But when asked, no one knew who they were or where they came from. Then came the night of the missing servant. He was young, newly recruited, known for trembling hands. He was tasked with carrying candles to the throne. Witnesses claimed his flame went out halfway down the hall, though no wind stirred. The boy froze. The queen's gaze locked on him. She smiled, thin and sharp, and whispered something only he could hear. Moments later, he was gone. Some say he ran. Others swear he was pulled into the darkness between the pillars. The court searched for him. His bed was still made, his clothes untouched, but the queen only raised her hand for silence. "The dead," she said softly, "require their messenger." From that night, her obsession grew worse. Servants now spoke in whispers at all hours, even outside the hall. Doors were shut, curtains drawn. If the kingdom once had a palace, now it had a tomb. And yet a question haunted them all. If the missing boy had not fled, then where was he? And what exactly had the queen whispered into his ear before he vanished? The queen announced a feast, not a celebration, not a festival, but what she called the banquet of shadows. No one dared question her. Invitations were sent to every noble within reach, sealed with black wax. Rumors spread faster than the messengers. Why would a queen who banned laughter host a feast? Why would a palace that lived as a tomb open its doors? On the night of the banquet, the great hall was unrecognizable. Long tables stretched into darkness, but they were not covered with silks or gold. They were draped in black shrouds, as if for a funeral. Every plate was carved from stone. Every goblet was made of tarnished silver. Instead of flowers, skulls, painted or real, were arranged as centerpieces, and every candle burned dim, casting more shadow than light. The guests arrived clothed in mourning black. They had been instructed to do so in the Queen's letters. Some came willingly, some in terror of refusal. They bowed, offered their greetings in whispers, and were led to their seats. But what unsettled them most were not the decorations. It was the servants. For the first time, outsiders witnessed what the Queen had made of her court. Dozens of servants stood against the walls, painted gray, their faces hollow, their lips darkened as though they had risen from the grave. Their movements were stiff, rehearsed, unnatural. When one guest nervously laughed at the sight, the Queen's hand shot up. "The dead do not laugh," she hissed. The hall fell silent. The feast began. Dishes of meat arrived, but cut into shapes meant to resemble organs. Bowls of grapes appeared, shriveled and rotting. Wine was poured, but it was watered until it looked like blood. Some nobles touched none of it, too repulsed. Others forced bites down, terrified of insulting their queen. Then came the procession. At her signal, the servants began to move. They shuffled down the center of the hall, arms limp, heads lolling, moaning in rehearsed whispers. They circled the tables as if the dead themselves had risen to join the banquet. Guests looked at one another, horrified but powerless. Finally, the Queen rose. Her veil shimmered in the dim light. She raised her goblet. "Tonight," she whispered, "we dine not as the living. We dine as the dead, who never abandon us." She drank deeply. The nobles followed, some trembling so violently they nearly dropped their cups. And then she began to speak to the shadows. Her eyes darted to empty chairs, to spaces where no one sat. She leaned forward, murmuring as if listening to replies. "Yes, yes, I understand," she whispered. "You hunger too." The guests shifted uneasily. One lord whispered to another that perhaps the Queen was playing theater to frighten them. But the illusion broke when one of the corpse servants collapsed. He fell face first to the floor, rigid. Gasps filled the hall. Two others lifted him, carrying his stiff body away. The Queen did not blink. She only smiled. "The dead have chosen him. He will not return." That moment shattered any belief that this was mere theater. If the servant had fainted, why was he never seen again? If it was a performance, why did the Queen's smile linger so long, too calm, too certain? By the end of the night, nobles left the hall shaken, whispering vows never to return. But the Queen was not done. That same evening, she declared a new decree. Every banquet henceforth would honor both the living and the dead. Servants would continue their corpse dances. Guests would dine in whispers. The palace would remain forever a funeral stage. Days passed. One by one, servants vanished. Always without sound, always after nights of strange rituals. No bodies were buried in the graveyards. No coffins were lowered into the ground. Yet whispers in the palace grew louder, as if those who vanished were still there, unseen, whispering back. The Queen's legend spread beyond her borders. Merchants refused to trade near her court. Foreign nobles declined her invitations. But no one dared confront her. For those within the palace, survival meant silence. They learned not to question the rituals, not to break the illusion, not to laugh, not to sing, not to speak above a whisper. But beneath it all, a single question grew stronger. When a queen blurs the line between the living and the dead, how long before the dead themselves answer? The palace had ceased to be a royal court. It was now a theater of death, a stage where every gesture, every word was controlled by the Queen's obsession. But it was within the hidden corridors, behind closed doors, that her rituals took their darkest form. The servants called it the Chamber of Whispers. It was a long, vaulted room beneath the throne hall, where echoes carried like voices of the dead. Only at night did the Queen allow it to be entered. She ordered her corpse servants to gather there, each lying flat on the cold stone floor, hands folded across their chests as though already buried. Torches burned low, their flames smothered in thick smoke, so the room glowed faintly like a crypt. At the center stood a single black chair. The Queen sat upon it, veiled in shadows, waiting. Then came the ritual. One by one, the servants were commanded to rise. They shuffled forward, bowed, and whispered confessions as if speaking from the grave. "I am forgotten. I am unclean. I am hungry." Each phrase was rehearsed, drilled into them. But sometimes, the whispers changed. A servant once murmured words no one recognized. His whisper carried, deep and guttural, like a language older than any man knew. He collapsed moments later, his body twitching, his eyes rolled white. When the others rushed to him, the Queen stopped them. "Do not touch. The dead have spoken through him. He belongs to them now." He was dragged away. No one saw him again. The chamber grew more dangerous with each ritual. Some servants began to believe the Queen was not imagining voices. She was summoning them. They spoke of cold hands brushing against their shoulders, when no one stood near. They swore they heard answers to their whispers, faint but clear, coming from the walls themselves. The queen fed their terror. She demanded that every missing servant had not vanished. They had crossed over. She claimed they now served her from the other side, and to prove her power, she would call their names aloud. The air would grow heavy. Sometimes in the silence, a faint moan echoed back. Fear spread like rot. The servants became prisoners, trapped in silence and ritual. They could no longer speak freely. They whispered only what was commanded. Outside the palace, rumors bloomed into horror. Farmers refused to work the queen's land. Children whispered of the ghost court that lured souls into its walls. But there was one who could not keep silent. Her name was Alira, a maid tasked with preparing the queen's chamber. Unlike others, she had not grown up within the court. She had been brought in after her village paid tribute. She carried no loyalty, only survival, and what she saw chilled her beyond endurance. One night, when she was summoned to light the torches of the chamber, she saw something others did not. A line of footprints, wet and dark, trailing across the floor. They were not from any servant present. They led into the center of the room, toward the queen's chair, yet no one had walked there. Alira whispered about it to another servant. By morning, he was gone, his bed empty, his name forbidden to be spoken aloud. The queen had banned the memory of him entirely. Alira understood then. Silence was survival, but silence was also death. To stay meant to become another shadow. And so she began to watch closely, searching for patterns in the queen's madness. She noticed the disappearances happened only after certain rituals, nights when the whispers grew loudest. She noticed the queen always chose the weakest or most frightened among them. And she noticed something else. The queen never seemed to eat. At feasts she raised her goblet, but her lips stayed dry. At meals she cut her food but never swallowed. The more Alira watched, the more she realized the queen was not merely mourning. She was feeding on fear, on silence, on obedience. The chamber of whispers was not for the servants. It was for her. Still, no one dared resist. One attempt was made. A guard, once loyal to the crown, drew his sword during a ritual, shouting that he would end the madness. He did not make it 2 steps. His blade fell from his hands, clattering to the stone. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He collapsed, his body stiff, as though frozen by unseen hands. The queen never moved from her chair. She only whispered, "The dead will have their offerings." His body was carried away. After that, no one tried again. The chamber became the palace's heart. Every night, whispers echoed like a chorus of the damned. Servants dreaded their turn to kneel and speak, for each word might be their last. Nobles stopped visiting altogether. The queen's rule became isolated, yet absolute, and the kingdom beyond the walls began to believe the palace itself had fallen into the hands of the dead. But for Alira, terror hardened into resolve. She knew she could not escape alone. She began to plot, not to fight, but to reveal. For if the world outside saw what happened within, the queen's spell might break. Yet every plan risked exposure. Every thought risked being overheard by the whispers that seemed to live in the walls. And the questions she feared most lingered always. Were those whispers truly the echoes of the dead? Or had the queen given them life herself? By now, the palace was less a home than a graveyard. Each night, fewer servants answered the queen's summons. Each morning, fewer bodies walked the halls. The queen never acknowledged their absence. She spoke instead of her growing court of the departed, as though every disappearance was not a loss but a gain. At first, the vanishings had been subtle. One maid here, a guard there. People assumed escape, but escape should have left footprints, rumors, whispers from the outside world. None came. No family reported seeing their lost kin again. The palace gates never opened without notice, and those who watched swore no one had left. The vanished were gone in truth, not in body but in essence, erased as if consumed by the very stones. The servants still present began to live like prey. They whispered in corners, trading warnings. Don't draw her gaze too long. Don't tremble when she speaks. Don't break the silence. But even their whispers grew dangerous. One kitchen boy confided in his friend that he wished to flee. The next night, both beds lay empty. Alira kept her silence, but she watched. She marked the nights when the vanishings occurred, always after a ritual in the chamber, always when the queen's voice grew lowest, when her whispers sounded not like human speech, but like 2 voices overlapping, one her own, the other something else, something deeper. She began to suspect that disappearances were not punishment, but sacrifice. The queen was offering her people to whatever force she claimed spoke through the walls, perhaps to keep her power, perhaps to keep the voices alive. And yet, what unsettled Alira most was the change in those who remained. Servants who had once trembled now moved like shadows themselves. Their faces were pale, their eyes vacant. They whispered without prompting, murmuring phrases that seemed not their own. It was as though the line between the living and the dead was truly blurring. One night, as Alira prepared the queen's veil, she dared to glance into her eyes. What she saw there was worse than madness. It was hunger, not for food, not for drink, but for obedience, for silence, for the slow death of all who lived under her rule. That night, Alira swore to herself. She would not vanish. She would not join the chorus of whispers. She would survive, even if it meant becoming the betrayer of her queen. But survival came at a cost. To live, she would have to expose the truth. And exposing the truth meant witnessing the darkest ritual of all, one no servant had lived to describe. The queen had begun preparing for it. The chamber of whispers was being altered, more torches extinguished, more symbols carved into the stone. The servants whispered of an eternal binding, a night when the queen would seal her bond with the dead forever. Alira realized then that the vanishings were not the end. They were the beginning. The missing were not gone. They were being gathered, prepared. And whatever the queen was summoning, it was not finished yet. The whispers grew louder as the night approached. Servants moved like shadows, their eyes hollow, their voices thin. Alira knew something final was coming. The queen called it the binding. None dared ask what it meant. On the chosen night, the chamber of whispers was transformed. The stone floor was covered with markings burned into the rock, circles within circles, lines crossing like webs. At the center, a hollow space awaited, as if for a body. Torches were snuffed until only a faint red glow remained. The servants were ordered to lie in rows, their arms folded across their chests, imitating the dead once more. The queen entered last. Draped in layers of black, her veil trailing across the stone, she moved with slow, deliberate steps. She raised her hands, and the room silenced to nothing but breath. Then she spoke, not to the living, but to the shadows. "We are ready." Her voice echoed strangely, doubled, as though another spoke with her. The air grew heavy. The torches flickered, though no wind stirred. And then the whispers began. Not from the servants, but from the walls, the ceiling, the very stones. Countless voices murmuring in unison. Some moaned, some wept, some laughed. Alira lay among the rows, her body rigid, her eyes shut. She felt something brush against her cheek, though no one stood near. She wanted to scream, but silence was survival. She forced her breath slow, shallow, pretending to be as lifeless as those around her. The queen moved through the rows, whispering over each servant. One by one, their bodies stiffened. Some gasped once before falling silent. Their whispers joined the chorus, as though their souls were leaving them, pulled into the walls. The queen smiled, her hands trembling with ecstasy. Then she stopped at the hollow center. She lifted her veil, and for the first time, Alira saw her fully. The queen's face was pale, her lips cracked, her eyes ringed with shadows, but her gaze was sharp, alive with unnatural fire. She raised her arms. "Tonight," she said, "the dead are no longer visitors. They are my court, they are my kingdom, and I am theirs." The voices rose, screaming and whispering all at once. The stones groaned as though the palace itself were alive. Alira felt her chest tighten, her breath failing. She thought she would be dragged into the chorus, erased like the others. But then she saw something. In the queen's shadow, cast against the wall, there was not one figure but many, arms stretching, faces forming, bodies writhing. The missing servants, their shapes clawed outward, trapped in her darkness. Alira understood then. The binding was not a summoning. It was a prison. The queen was binding the souls of the vanished into herself, feeding on them, wearing them like jewels of power. The revelation nearly broke her silence, but she knew one sound, one scream, and she would be pulled into the shadow as well. So she lay still, her heart pounding, as the queen whispered the final words of her ritual. And in that moment, Alira swore. If she survived this night, she would not let the truth die with her. Alira did survive. When the ritual ended, she remained among the rows of silent bodies, unmoving, her breath shallow. The queen, satisfied, declared the binding complete. She left the chamber surrounded by whispers that trailed her like servants of air. When at last the torches dimmed and the others lay stiff in their false death, Alira slipped away. She did not flee that night, not yet. To run blindly would mean being dragged back by the shadows she had seen. Instead, she watched. She listened. She recorded the truth in secret notes, scraps of parchment hidden beneath the stones of her chamber. She traced the pattern of vanishings, the words of the rituals, the strange language the queen sometimes spoke when her voice doubled. Every detail she could hold on to became a weapon, not for her alone, but for whoever might come after. And then, one morning, Alira too was gone. Her bed lay empty, her belongings untouched, no trace of escape. Some claimed she was taken like the others. Others swore she had fled into the wilderness, carrying her secrets. The truth was never found. But weeks later, rumors spread. Far beyond the palace, in distant villages, scraps of parchment appeared, torn pages describing the Chamber of Whispers, drawings of the queen's rituals, lists of names of the vanished. No one knew who carried them or how they escaped the castle walls. But the whispers traveled faster than her shadow. The queen still ruled. The palace still stood. But now her legend was larger than her kingdom. Mothers warned their children, do not whisper too long in the dark, or the queen will hear you. Travelers avoided the roads near her court. Some claimed to see pale figures at the windows, staring out with empty eyes. And so the cycle deepened. The queen had made herself eternal. Not through armies, not through monuments, but through fear. Her palace became more than stone. It became a story. And stories once told do not die. To this day, no record tells us when her reign ended. No grave bears her name. Some claim she still walks the halls of her ruined palace, veiled and whispering, her servants nothing but shadows etched into the walls. Others believe she found her final victory, erasing herself so completely that she became the very silence she worshipped. But one question lingers, sharp as the first whisper in the chamber. What if Alira's notes were real? What if they survive still, passed in secret, waiting to be found? And if they are found, if the rituals are spoken again, who will stop the dead from being welcomed once more into the halls of the living? Perhaps, even now, the cycle waits. Not in her palace, not in her throne, but in the silence of every room where whispers echo too long. So I leave you with this thought. If you find yourself alone, speaking softly in an empty room, and the air answers back, ask yourself, is it only an echo? Or has the queen's court come to claim you too?